Okay, great. I think it's time. Morning, everyone. First breakout session of the conference. We'll try to get your conference going off to a good start. And just to make sure that you're in the right room, we're going to talk about strategies for managing content on Tableau Server, right? Start with a quick introduction. So Dave and I are a solutions consultant working in the what we call NEMEA region. So Dave covers Middle East. I cover, predominantly Denmark. So we work with clients. It's a client-facing role, and we spend a lot of time in front of enterprise clients, kind of helping them with anything related to Tableau, really. Maybe Dave would help me with a more detailed introduction.
Yeah, just a quick introduction. I'm realizing we've got a column right in the middle where we're standing, so I'm going to sort of move backwards and forwards. So Alex is one of my great friends at Tableau. He's a born Russian, moved to the UK for many years with his wife. He's got a lovely daughter as well. He's British through and through, but I don't think he's lost his Russianness. You know, he's kind of got this, very planned mind, very sort of thorough in his thinking, very sort of methodical in the way that he approaches stuff. Everything's, in its right place, which makes him the perfect person for introducing and talking about this kind of topic. It's how do you get things in order. And I thought just to prove to you how good Alex is at this kind of stuff, I'd show you a picture of his desk. So, this is typical Alex, right? Just, perfectly ordered, even a bit of camo gear in the back representing his time in his national service, always doing that kind of thing. So that's Alex for you.
Okay, great. So Dave, so obviously worked together with Dave for 3.5 years now at Tableau. He's got a variety of different interests. He's really into films. He likes Stanley Kubrick films. He's got, I would say, encyclopedic knowledge of the music industry. Before Tableau, he worked in marketing and digital marketing. So I guess you could say that with that type of a background, he's a bit like a creative type. And just to illustrate that, we've taken a picture of his desk. And as you can see, it's quite clean. Pay attention to the Windows desktop, like very clean and minimalistic, just one single icon in the middle. I cannot quite see what it is, probably Tableau shortcut. And also pay attention to the book. So obviously Dave is very good at planning things ahead, right? So why do we care about this subject so much? So as I said already, we spend a lot of time in the field with clients. And what we've noticed is that there is a lot of, when we work with clients managing Tableau Server environments, Tableau is very good. We have a lot of material on how things work conceptually, right? You can easily find how permissions work, how you can set up groups and users and things like that. But we never really talk that much about how to actually implement all those concepts in practice. And this is what this session is really all about. So before we continue, just quickly understand who we have in the audience. So how many of you actually like Tableau Server administrators or manage Tableau Server? Okay, but actually most people in the room, great. And how many of you would say you have a relatively mature Tableau server, like self-service server that's been used, let's say, for a couple of years? Not that many. So most people are relatively new, which is great, right? This is the kind of the time you should make the right decision, because otherwise it would be too late. So just a bit of kind of my perspective on things. In general, when we meet with clients, we kind of meet with we see two types of environments in the field, right? So one type of environment looks like this, right? Everything is in the right place. Everything is folded neatly. You know exactly where to find things. Everything is clean, like any clothes that you don't use anymore, maybe you want to get rid of it. So it's kind of a perfect nirvana scenario, right? So, and this is in general what people kind of aspire to have, right? And here is an example of I guess, more of a reality, right? Or maybe where people usually start. Especially, I would say, when you have a smaller team, you tend to trust all your users, right? So you don't actually impose any like governance rules. You just kind of trust people that they're going to do the right thing. And quite often what we find is you start with something that looks like this, but then eventually as time goes by and you onboard more users, you do want to have some kind of order and control over that chaos that you sometimes start with, right? So another question for you. Can you guys name a particular celebrity who is known for like helping people, how to organize things? And what I mean by that, just outside of the context of IT in general, organizing belongings, clothes, and things like that. Can anyone name a certain person, certain celebrity?
Okay. Perfect.
Okay.
Not even primed.
Exactly right. So we have, in case of, some of you don't know who this is, Marie Kondo is this lady from Japan. She has her own show on Netflix. And what she does is she goes to people's houses and basically helps people to get things in order, right? Her Netflix show is quite famous, and she's also written a book. One of the kind of the questions she would normally ask people, she would usually say something like this, like, does it spark joy, right? So this little piece of clothes or something like that, like you may be emotionally attached to it, but do you actually need it, or maybe you can get rid of it, right? So trying to rephrase this and put it into the context of Tableau, the question we'll try to answer today is, does your Tableau content spark joy, right? So let's talk about the agenda. Basically, what the whole idea of this session is we're going to try to kind of apply some of the lessons from Marie Kondo in the context of Tableau environment, right? And the agenda, we're going to start with talking about projects and sites and nested projects. And using a quote from Marie Kondo, we're going to try to answer this question, or try to kind of answer this question: how do we make a home for everything we own, right? Then we'll talk about this concept of planning things ahead, right? So we come up with a framework for how to organize your users and your content, and as Marie Kondo would say, how do we follow the plan? We'll talk a little bit about automation. So as time goes by, what we find is clients have a lot of stale content that's not actually being used. And we will try to give you some ideas how to manage that as well, right? So it's something that we see a lot, especially in more mature environments. People want to basically come up with a way of dealing with stale workbooks, extracts, and things like that. And finally, we'll talk about the concept of a sandbox. It's a relatively small little tip, but we see it's actually really powerful, and it opens a kind of Tableau Server environment to self-service while you still preserve this governance and control over what's actually going on, right? So that's something that we'll cover today as well. Okay, so lesson number 1, make a home for everything you own. Choosing between one sites and many. So something that comes up a lot, especially with people who just start with Tableau Server. And I'll probably try to just explain a little bit what is it we're actually talking about here. Maybe some of you who are very new to Tableau is when you have a Tableau Server, one of the very first decisions you make when you install it is you basically decide how many sites you have. By default, you just have one site, but you can easily create more sites. And what a site is, it's like you can think of it as a kind of like a logical mini Tableau Server inside of a Tableau Server, right? So this is the way you can partition your content, right? And the way it works is basically each site is completely isolated in a way, right? So a site would have a site admin, would have site users, content belongs to a site, and there is no easy way to move content between sites, right? So they're completely isolated. What we find is that clients, when they start with Tableau Server, the most obvious decision would be, I'm just going to give a site to every single department that I have. So you start with something that looks like this. Again, works well, maybe on the smaller scale. What we see happens is, as time goes by, you start seeing this proliferation of sites. You just have too many of them. And also remember that in a modern workday environment, quite often we have this cross-functional, cross-departmental work, right? So it's not just one department works in isolation from all other departments. You might have marketing collaborating with sales or something like that. And this concept doesn't quite work in that case, right? So where do I actually put all that stuff that multiple departments need to have access to? So the other approach we see is kind of the opposite of that. I'm just going to have one single site, and everything will just be packaged into projects, right? A project is basically like a folder, and we've, in version 10.5, we also introduced nested projects, right? So it actually makes it a bit easier to have this hierarchical structure. So in theory, you could have just one site, and that works quite well. One thing I would say about that approach is, obviously remember that there is still kind of, you're kind of leaving this a bit of a room for human error, right? So let's say you have some content that is very sensitive, maybe payroll data or HR data. And if you have a structure that looks like this, somebody by mistake could just publish a workbook to the wrong project, right? And that's it, basically. You basically create a whole, huge problem for yourself. So what is the right solution? So in my experience, this hybrid approach actually works quite well, right? So you do need to have this one single site that everyone would use, but you do want to have maybe one or two sites where you actually exclusively use for this sensitive data that no one else should have access to, right? And this is a way of basically having the best of both. So I briefly mentioned nested projects. Again, something that we introduced in version 10.5, and this is a bit of a history lesson, I guess. Before 10.5, the world in Tableau was flat. You could basically just have one site and one single level of projects under that one site, and that was it.
Should we just check who here was on Tableau before 10.5? Oh. So we do have some old timers. Okay, cool.
So 10.5, finally, actually people have been asking for this for quite a long time. They wanted to have nested projects. We did introduce that feature, so now we have nested projects, which kind of means that, okay, that's great. We could potentially use it just for everything. So the example I had on the previous slide, could we just have one single project for the whole of the department, and everything else is going to be nested? Does that approach work? Well, it depends, not quite. So let me just give you a little bit more context of how that works, specifically with permissions first, right? So again, I'm getting a bit more technical here, but basically, any object in Tableau Server would have permissions, right? And there are two ways you can manage permissions. You can either log those permissions to a project, which basically means that every time a user publishes a new piece of content into the project, that permissions will be inherited from the project it's published to. Or the other way would be to basically just leave it unlocked, which means that every person who publishes a piece of content to Tableau Server makes the decision of the permissions that are going to be applied to that content, right? In general, what we see works well in more mature environments, as you have more and more users, is you do want to log those permissions to project level, because that's the way to, again, govern your environment, right? And we generally recommend that approach. It's just basically more manageable, more predictable in a way. However, one thing you need to remember is how that works specifically with nested projects. So when the trick here is that you can only lock permissions to the parent, but not to the child. That makes sense? Yeah? So in a situation, let me give you a more practical example. In a situation like this, when we have multiple departments, let's say we have marketing, sales, and HR, we might want to have different nested projects. So let's say development, production, and data sources. And what I would like to do is I would like to have permissions applied not at the root level, but at this child level, right? So I want to have something that looks like this. But remember what we just discussed on the previous slide, this is not actually something that you can do in Tableau today, at least, right? You can only lock permissions at the root level. So from the permission point of view, this structure does not quite work. Even though we can nest projects in Tableau, the approach from the permission point of view would still have that flat structure, right? If you do want to have these different permissions to dev, prod, and data sources, for example, applied at the project level, you do have to go with this flat structure, even though you can have nested projects as a kind of a logical way of grouping content. Right. So what's the takeaway from this?
Well, it's quite simple. Your project structure has to be flat in order for the lock permissions to work across the different folders. And we'll touch on that more when we go through the next chapter. Oh, no, we're not in the next chapter yet. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I guess, so the question then is that do we use nested projects at all, right? What's the point if I cannot have those permissions applied that way? Well, let me give you, again, a little bit of a history lesson. From the user experience point of view, I actually spent a lot of time last year meeting with clients, and they were all in different versions, and we would get different feedback depending on which version the client would use. So nested projects were first introduced in version 10.5. And by default, the way UX worked is if I click on the project, we would always default to the project tab, even though if there are no nested projects in there. So that was actually confusing to many people because I want to see content, and by default I go to this tab when there is nothing, right? So actually every time I want to see workbooks, I have to go to a different tab, which was confusing from the user experience point of view. So we listened to the feedback, and in version 18.1 we changed it, and by default we started showing workbooks instead of projects, right? So that worked for some people, but then some other people were upset because they actually wanted to see projects, not workbooks. So it was quite hard to find the right balance, basically, between the two approaches. And then eventually the whole thing was redesigned, and in 19.1 this year we introduced this new concept of mixed content, which basically means is we're going to show you everything. If you have nested projects, if you have workbooks, when you click on the project, you're going to see everything. And what that means is, from the user experience point of view, what we kind of recommend is please do use nested projects for kind of to logically group your content, not in order to apply permissions, but just to make it more user-friendly, if that makes sense, right? So for example, here we have marketing department. I have the most important dashboards with KPIs, which are published directly to this project, right? And then I have some nested projects, maybe with some campaigns and some events. And the reason I use these nested projects is just to make it more user-friendly, so that people don't get lost and we don't try to throw too much at the user. Okay? And just to give you a bit of how many people here use 19.2? Obviously very new, it just came out. Not many. Oh, 1, 2. Okay. So not many people. So I'm just going to quickly show you what it looks like in the latest version. Just 1 second. Okay, let's do this. Right, so this is 19.2. I'm actually using Tableau Online. And it kind of looks similar to the previous versions. Notice that the interface is a bit different. We don't have the blue ribbon at the top. That was replaced with this kind of gray panel on the left-hand side. So the way I navigate my content is I still can go to projects and look at workbooks and things like that. So, but there is a new homepage. So when a new user logs into Tableau Server, I don't actually see any projects at all. What I see is what is relevant to me, right? What I mean by that is I see any workbooks that I have favorited personally, right? I see all the workbooks that I personally have visited, because what we find is when people go to Tableau Server, they tend to look at the same workbook basically every day or every week. So we want to surface that frequently used content and just kind of put it in front of the user. And also this element over here is I guess you could call it trending content, right? So what other people are looking at. Again, it kind of helps people to discover maybe new interesting content or that's been published to Tableau Server. So the old way of navigating content is still there. You can still have projects and nested projects and everything that we just talked about. But we're just trying to, Tableau, we're trying to come up with new ideas of how to surface that content to users and not just necessarily make it look like a kind of a file server where people kind of go from one directory to another. Okay.
So I think the key takeaway from this is that the nested projects have always been requested. It's a really good thing. I mean, I remember working with many customers in Holland, actually, in particular, who are just saying, when can we have these folders? When we have these nested folder structures? It's a great addition to the user experience, but of course it has this overhead of permissions and allowing, you've got to think about it before you just deploy it. So it sounds cool, but there's always this kind of overhead to have to think about. So moving on to the next thing, hoping that my clicker is working. Yes, cool. So lesson number 2 is following the plan. And I guess the obvious point about that is you have to have a plan to begin with, and that may be alluding to the takeaway at the end of the session. So you've got to put your structure in place, and you've got to lock things down. You've got to essentially try and avoid this kind of scenario. Now, I appreciate we're in Germany, the home of organisation, the home of good process and all that kind of thing. But in the UK, it's pretty common to always have a drawer like this in your kitchen, right? There's always one drawer where everything goes. It just gets thrown in there, and then, frankly, you never use it, because you never know what's in there or how to access it when it comes time to use it. And it'll have all things, holiday souvenirs, wires for the garden, all bits and pieces. And unfortunately, in a lot of unorganized organizations, this is pretty much what the Tableau server looks like. Okay? It is just, let's just chuck it in there. And I know we like to say, oh, let's be creative and let's, maybe not have anarchy, but let's encourage people's creative juices to try these things out. But this isn't good for anybody, right? What we need to get to is a situation where, we're being driven by the main drivers of manageability and predictability, that if the content is where it should be, people will go and get it, that they will build trust in the tool that they're using, and that actually it will just encourage usage, that people know where to go. And I certainly know that over time, we as a tool have developed. I know when I started at Tableau, in fact, we both joined relatively at the same time. Tableau was a bit chaotic in the way that it organized stuff, and I still remember some of our internal dashboards, of which there was like 10,000, 20,000. Like, we use it extensively internally. And to actually find the thing you're looking for, you just have to hope that somebody's named it right, or that they put a tag on the thing. It's like, okay, you can go only so far with that. Ideally, you want to get things into a nice folder structure that makes sense for everybody. So, how do you do this? Well, once you've got a plan that says, great, you've got all the places, a place for everything, you've also got to try and put in place a process that encourages this kind of activity or behavior. So similarly to, again, I suppose this isn't a German problem, but in England, we find that there's 2 types of people in the world. There's essentially those who know how to load a dishwasher and those that don't, okay? And I don't know which one you are, but there was a lot of admins here, so I'm thinking maybe you do know how to load one. Don't know, we'll see. But, there are those people who just go, oh, it's a dishwasher, just throw it in there. Oh, the main job of the dishwasher is dishwashing. So throw it in, it will get washed. Obviously, there's an element of care, of making sure things aren't too cramped together. But the real point I'm trying to make here is if you're a process-oriented person, the way you load it speeds up the time it takes to unload it. You kind of got this content that you can easily put into those drawers immediately if you've got a bit for your spoons, a bit for your forks, a bit for your plates, etc. So what I'm saying is if you can impose structure across the process, you'll find that the process as a whole becomes easier to follow, and actually everybody's life gets better. So how to begin in terms of organizing your content and your audiences? So how to begin? You've got to go through these sort of 4 steps of defining your audience, your user types, the workflow, and your restrictions. And I just want to go back right to the basics, which I expect, given that most of the audiences are admins here, you'll have gone through the basics of permissions, but let me just do this again for anybody else who perhaps isn't familiar with this. Within Tableau, you can set your permissions, i.e. who can do what, who can see what. You can set them at all different levels of content, but also in terms of either groups or individual users. The difficulty is we give you the flexibility to potentially set them at all different levels. And you can imagine that in a small organization, yeah, maybe you might lock a few things down. Yeah, this seems quite easy to do, but as soon as the organization grows, what you find is that because you're able to have such flexibility, you actually sort of induce a bit of chaos, certainly a bit of increase the workload for the admins. What you generally find is people are trying to build specific rules that connect specific users to specific content, to specific projects, and you create, potentially hundreds of rules that are A, hard to surface and see within the tool, but also extremely hard to manage, right? So as a sort of golden rule of Tableau, and this has, I think, pretty much always been the case, we're trying to say move away from a sort of a complicated ad hoc structure and make sure that you're always setting the permissions at the group level or at the project level. And I say there at the bottom, always is a bad word to use. There's always exceptions, right? But the difference is, as an admin, you're managing exceptions. You're trying to put in place some structure that says, okay, in this particular scenario, maybe I do have to walk around the structure, but for the vast majority of people, just having these sort of simple, organized group and project level permissions should be good enough. So we go to the question of audiences. Who sees what within an organization? And you've generally got a choice of how you wish to sort of split your content. Most people that we see tend to split in one of these two, which is they either do it in a sort of departmental basis, kind of as Alex was mentioning before, of course you might split it by HR, sales, or whatever departments you've got or lines of business in your organization, or it might be by roles. That's what those pictures on the far side might be. You might have farmers who suddenly need to access the content that you're putting on Tableau Server. But yeah, you make the choice depending on what works for you and your organization. You've then got to talk about user function. So in your organization, who is going to be doing what with the content that you provide? Now, it kind of might seem relatively simple, but actually, if you're in a small organization, it's like, oh, it's simple. Everybody just, we do self-service. Everybody creates, everybody publishes, everybody shares. Isn't that wonderful? And, that is the Tableau story. But, we are admins. And admins need to control or, at least put some things in place that is going to make sense of all that. So in terms of user functions, what I'm really saying is, are they doing different types of things with the data? So, for instance, are they perhaps publishing the data sources, but perhaps those people aren't the same as the people creating the content? I don't think we've got it in our presentation, but historically we used to use the phrase like a data steward, somebody getting the data ready for for other people to take advantage of. You've got to think about if there's approval process. If content has to be reviewed before it's put in front of the general public, for the general viewers in the organization. And also I've got that terrible word there, that's not actually a real English word, but okay. Can publishers directly productionize workbooks, i.e., do I have a direct connection with the people who are consuming the content? Can I just publish and they see, or does it have to go through some kind of workflow? So, speaking of workflows, that is, how can whatever it is I'm doing, how can whatever happen? I have 3 scenarios to put in front of you. So again, keeping with the kind of house, kitchen sort of thoughts, we've got our crock pot or hot pot here. This is the simplest methodology. And this is, well, what's a hot pot or a crock pot? It's where you have all your ingredients, you chuck it in one saucepan, and then it goes, you just put it straight on the table and people sort of grab from it and eat. And that's the simplest Tableau scenario, which is you have creators that just simply push content out and essentially have a direct connection between people who then consume the content. You might choose to, split it into different folders. Maybe they do have their own sandbox or departmental sandbox, but it's, it's basically a direct connection between them and the viewer. So this is the simple workflow. Now we can get slightly more complex than that, and this is moving now towards what I'd say is probably the typical server that I see. And this is the typical kitchen, where actually you begin to get into like a professional world where there are certain stations for doing certain things. You have specific roles doing specific functions, and the work gets passed from one area to the other. You've got people cutting, chopping, and ultimately somebody cleaning up. So this is what I'd call the intermediate sort of flow, the restaurant flow, which is, I've added a couple of roles in here. So for instance, we have the idea of a creator, but in this case, this is now the data source creator. Maybe this is the data steward. This is somebody who is publishing content for other people to take advantage of. Once it's there, maybe in a given departmental folder, that can be picked up by the other creators, i.e. the people actually building the content, and then published to other people in the organization. Now, I've actually added in this second role here, the content approver, i.e. somebody that potentially only has a viewer license. They don't have to do anything complex with the data. They're not there to be drilling, slicing, or whatever. Maybe they do, but the role in this scenario is just simply the content gets published to a departmental sandbox. They look at it, they check that it works, it fits, it has the right formatting, it has the right content, nobody's seeing things that they shouldn't. And then ultimately, the creator publishes to the approved workbook folder that everybody can then see. So sort of similar to before, but with those 2 additional roles. So then moving from the intermediate, we move on to, oh, sorry, forgot to say, we've now got, one thing I do want to mention about permissions, this is kind of an aside, but generally, we don't encourage sort of locking down or denying any permissions across Tableau. But we thought we'd throw this one out there as a little tip, which is we tend to encourage people to stop allowing people to move content from one folder to another. And it kind of seems a little bit, to me, I think it's kind of unintuitive. But what happens is if somebody's trying to move, say, from the departmental sandbox to the approved folder, if there's some content over in the other folder that actually has the same name as something that you're trying to move, Tableau will complain. It will say, no, can't do it, there's already content there. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just saying, hey, you've got some new content, that makes sense. But what that tends to do is you get those users, the approvers, going into the other folder and deleting that content, and then moving it. Okay, so where's the problem in that? Well, there's no problem with the content there, but what happens is if you've got content in that approved content folder that has alerts and subscriptions and specific custom views that people have created, as soon as that content gets deleted, they're gone, right? So you move content over, but it's lost that kind of meta information, the way that content's being consumed within the organization. So as a whole, what we're trying to encourage here, just with this little tip, is to say, don't allow people to move stuff across. Try and get the original publishers to republish, to publish over the top in the sort of the approved folder, as it were. Maintain that, the delineation of roles between the approvers and the sort of creator publishers. Does that make sense? Everybody with that? Okay, cool. So we move on to the third workflow or scenario, and this is really, we've got away from the kitchen, we've got away from a single dish. We're actually moving into, full-on food production. We're looking at a processing line of generating or creating food, and the same with content, if we can see food as being the sort of Tableau content. I did think about these slides. There are connections somewhere between them. So now this is a very complex scenario, and to be honest, there are very few Tableau customers who go to this level of complexity, but it does exist, and I'm hoping it won't seem too confusing to you guys in the audience. I've added a few new roles again. So we've got the concept of a explorer, we've got this idea of ad hoc workbooks and approvers. We've still got the same dashboard, data source creator at the top, and people publishing stuff in the sort of regular approved manner. But what we're trying to do is say, but there will still be those people, the analysts, the heavy users of the world, who need to have a bit more flexibility with the things they do. They don't necessarily always want to go to an approved workbook folder. We want to have a space that they can play, okay? So that's our Explorer. I made a point there. I've tried to keep in line with the licensing that we have in Tableau. So that Explorer means somebody who is capable of drilling in a kind of online, just via the server without having to use desktop. They're just there taking advantage of the data sources that are already provided and then publishing straight to the server. The other thing I've added is perhaps, I don't know, I thought it was worth calling out here that rather than just having the approver, there's actually somebody who does this kind of republishing of stuff from does that an extra step of not just approving the workbook, but actually is involved with promoting that content from one folder to the official sort of approved workbook stage. Now, like I say, for some of you, you'll look at this and go, oh, that's 7 steps where actually we only need 2. Like I say, this is what I'd say a advanced or a complex workflow, but it's definitely one or a version of one that we've seen in many organizations. And just to go back to some of the things that Alex was saying before, I'm just trying to remember my point here. So you've got to have, potentially, because you might have to have these locked folders at the sort of departmental level, you might find that you have to duplicate some of or have multiple folders for each section. So rather than having like an approved workbooks folder, you might have to have a marketing approved workbooks folder because you're locking down the permissions to the marketing team. So yeah, I'm just trying to encourage you to this is probably the way to go. But moving on, what it means is once you've got all these folders, it begins to get a little bit too complex to look at within Tableau. It's not easy within the interface to just work out perhaps where all the roles and the permissions are. So it probably makes sense to have a separate framework, a separate strategy that just keeps a note of all of the groups and all of the projects and the kinds of permissions that you've applied. Now, I'm committing a slight bit of heresy here because I'm not doing it in Tableau. But it's actually quite easy to have something like this in Excel. Just have a nice little sheet, a nice little a nice little matrix that shows you for every group, do they have access to any given project? Because what we're really encouraging is this kind of many project scenario and many sort of audience kind of role scenario where you just need something simple like this that people can pick up. So,
was the takeaway from that? Actually, before I even give you the takeaway, just a little pro tip, and that comes right from that matrix slide that we had before, is naming convention. Yeah, makes a lot of difference. Like, so basically, all these groups and projects, essentially the way you name them, actually a huge difference in terms of actually understanding what's going on, right? So, and that template that we come up with would tell you exactly, let's say you onboard a new department or a new user, what the name of the group is going to be, right? You just kind of follow that cookie cutter approach whenever you onboard a new piece of content or new group of users. So the takeaway here is simple, repeatable framework. Makes huge difference. We have a client with about 20,000 users in the Netherlands, and they basically have done something very similar to what we showed you on the previous slide. This is really how people manage that framework at scale. And a little side note, so obviously last year Tableau introduced this new role-based licensing, right? And before we did this, the world was relatively simple. What I mean by that is when we have a site and we create a new user, that user would have this something called a site role. And before we had the role-based licensing, we could basically make everyone a publisher. And that was actually kind of the recommendation. And then we would use permission to lock it down to what the actual permissions need to look like. So with the new licensing model, that is a little bit different. So there is a slight nuance now in terms of which license, user license, whether it's a viewer or explorer or creator, is going to be consumed by user. And this is actually determined by the site role that you assign to that user, right? So what we see people do in the field is, let's say you have an Active Directory group to manage your users, right? Your users come from that, you synchronize Tableau users from the Active Directory group, and you could actually have a purpose-built Active Directory group, which is only used to basically control which licenses are going to be given to each users. Does it make sense? Yeah? So that is just another little nuance that we actually find that's quite important in the new world of role-based licensing that people have to think about. Right. So nostalgia is not your friend. Next lesson from Marie Kondo. What does it mean? So I still have my very first workbook that I created 3.5 years ago. It still sits on my desktop. I look at it from time to time. No one else has any interest in it, of course, but it just brings some good memories for me personally. But we also see Tableau servers in the field where people still have Tableau samples projects, right? So Tableau samples is something by default. You kind of can create those samples. The famous Superstore workbook, and what's that one? I can't remember. Basically, people still have that stuff. Eventually, the point we're trying to make here is there is this stale content or clutter that people create, and it just kind of grows and grows and grows as your Tableau server becomes more mature. So why do we care about this? Creates a couple of problems. First of all, it actually consumes storage space, right? So especially when you publish a workbook with an extract, consumes storage space, consumes server resources. In particular, extract refreshes. We see this situation when users are given freedom to choose whatever extract schedule they want, and naturally, without any bad intent, they always go for the most frequent one, which is every 15 minutes. And what ends up happening is we have these extracts that are being refreshed every 15 minutes, and that's actually a very resource-intensive task, right? So somehow you want to control that situation, right? And finally, clutter in itself makes it hard to find the relevant content, right? So how do we manage this? If I use a very basic example of a workbook that is not being used, The first, we kind of follow this three-stage process. So we want to warn, archive, and delete. What does it mean? If we notice that a work has been published, let's say 3 months ago, no one's looked at it once since then, first thing we want to do is we want to notify the author of that workbook. So we actually want to send an email to the author saying, hey, maybe you want to do something about this. We take a bit more time. Eventually, we make a decision to take an action. We archive that workbook, maybe to a different project, or we actually delete it and send a copy of that workbook to the author. And finally, we just basically get rid of it. That's kind of high level, how it works. So this is not a functionality that is available in Tableau Server out of the box. But Tableau Server comes with many kind of rich APIs that actually enable this. And what we find is that clients with more mature environments, they actively use those APIs to manage this process. Yeah. A couple of tips I would like to give here. So first of all, you kind of want to be transparent with your users about what's actually going to happen. So let's say if you have a Sandbox project, you might want to put this little note saying that any content that is published to that project is going to be deleted after a certain period of time. We've seen clients use tags. So tags actually something that has been in Tableau Server for quite a long time, but not many people use it. But we've seen it's being used very successfully in this situation when, let's say, you archive a workbook and you want to put like a stamp that the original owner of that workbook was someone called Ludwig, and that was moved on a particular date or something like this, right? So communication is key. The other thing we see people do, so obviously use email, use messaging tools like Slack, so you just automatically send a message to the user about a workbook or an extract that you're going to do something with. Maybe more practical examples. So let's look at extracts specifically. I mentioned this problem of frequently updated extracts. Here is an example of what you can do with this. So you basically, let's say a person publishes a workbook, picks the 15-minute schedule, and then looks at it once, one click, and then nothing happens for a week. What do? Well, we actually go and automatically find this workbook, and then we reschedule the extract to only be refreshed once in an hour instead of once every 15 minutes, right? Again, another week goes by, no action is taken by any user, nobody actually looks at this workbook. We reschedule it again to be only refreshed once a day. Eventually what we do is we basically turn this extract refresh off, and if the author still wants to refresh the extract, you can still do it manually, go to the workbook and manually refresh the extract if you want to get the fresh data. So this is possible with APIs and the repository and things like that. I'll show you a quick demo of how that actually looks. Here's another example we see people do is manage performance. So performance is a huge subject. I'm sure there will be some sessions in this conference about performance. What we really care about is how much resource is being consumed by an unoptimized, poorly designed workbook, right? So what we do is same concept. We basically just kind of look at the repository. We look at which workbooks are unoptimized. And what we mean by that in this particular example, anything that takes longer than 30 seconds to render is unoptimized. And what we do with that workbook is we basically just send a notification to the author saying, hey, your workbook is not optimized. You might want to read up on best practices and do something with that workbook. A week goes by, nothing happens. The author ignores our email. We send another email. Nothing changes. It's still performing badly. Then we take another week, send another email. Again, the author of that workbook doesn't do anything. What we eventually do is we basically log the permissions so only the author can actually see it, but nobody else. And so again, this is something that actually people do in very large production environments, right? Because obviously, if you have a small team of 10 people, you can kind of help each other, do a bit of Tableau doctoring, and manually find these workbooks that are not performing. If you try to do this at scale, you might want to have something like this that is actually automated. And the next thing is more of an inspiration for me personally. I would like to see this implemented in the field. I haven't seen it yet. But there are tools, some of them like built by our partners, that actually automatically scan workbooks for poor design practices. So for example, I have a filter on a high cardinality dimension or something like that. That's a known problem, like you shouldn't do that in Tableau. So instead of just sending these emails saying, hey, your workbook is bad, you could maybe send an email which gives some tips about what can be improved, right? So again, we're trying to be more helpful, not just attack our user. Right, so this is all very conceptual. Sounds like a great idea, but how do you actually do something like this? Let me just give you a very, very basic demo of how you could build this kind of an automation, right? Okay. Great. So obviously Tableau desktop, hopefully people recognize. What I'm connecting to is something called repository, which is a component of Tableau Server where we keep all the metadata, and we'll also use it to store information about any events that happen. So for example, every time somebody accesses a workbook, that will be recorded in logs. It will also be recorded in the repository. So when I'm connecting to this repository, I'm literally taking two tables, workbooks and events. And what I would like to do with this is I would like to actually try to find these workbooks that are not being used. How do I do this? Very simple. I put all the workbooks. This is actually, by the way, my own Tableau server, so it's obviously not that much content published there. And then I run this calculation that maybe looks like this. I do date diff. So basically, we're looking at the duration, period of time, measured in days, between when that particular workbook has been accessed last time and today, right? Something like this. And we want to use mean as a type of aggregation because we're looking at the most recent time it's been accessed, if that makes sense. Right, so once I've done this, now I can see all my workbooks, and the bar here represents the number of days since I've looked at it last time. And you can obviously see that I'm not actually using my Tableau server that much. Most of the content, it's more than 20 days. So I actually maybe should do something with that. So how can I use this information? Well, actually, let's make it a bit more visual. So I can maybe add a reference line to this chart. And let's say we introduce a rule that we want to take some action on all the workbooks that have not been accessed for 60 days or more, right? I'm using a reference line, and maybe we can add a filter as well, right? So we add a filter. We say we only want to see workbooks that have not been accessed for at least 60 days, right? What do I do with this workbook? Well, actually, quite simply, I can use it in my actual logic. So if I have some kind of a script, I can go and look at this workbook, and I can access this data as a CSV file, right? So literally, this live view that takes data from the repository, I can basically feed it into my script. So all my script now needs to do is just iterate through this list of unused workbooks and go through each one of them one by one and take some action. Maybe send an email to the author or do something like this. So obviously, this is a very simplified demonstration. You probably want to do things like you don't want to run on all of the content on the Tableau server, maybe a specific project like Sandbox, right? Maybe you want to make this threshold dynamic, so it's not only just 60 days, but you can kind of move that filter. But the point I'm trying to make here is you can actually use Tableau itself to implement some of this logic about which workbooks we want to look at, which extracts are being refreshed but not actually being used. So all that can be done. And another tip from me would be to and by the way, you can see my desktop, the creative type. It's quite messy. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to duplicate. So another little tip. This is a very great blog that is, it's not actually maintained by a Tableau employee. It's one of our clients who manages one of the largest Tableau server implementations. And it's a real kind of a gem. It's amazing, right? So the sort of content that you find on this blog is basically everything that you just talked about, but it goes into much more detail about how to archive content, some best practices, where to look in the repository, and all these things. So I strongly recommend it. I don't actually know this person personally, but the content that he creates is just great. So So yeah.
So who here, as administrators, actually look at their repository?
So there's quite a few, but I would say not enough. It's quite a good. It's the real bed of information around your users and how they're using the system. It's not going to give you the performance stuff, but it's going to let you know how often things are being accessed, and it's a massive opportunity, particularly in this kind of the automation of tasks. And as Alex said, we've got a lot of very rich APIs, so there's a lot of things you can do there. So my little last lesson, and this really is a little small one, but it's very interesting from my perspective, because I had customers 2 to 3 years ago saying, we need our own little personal sandbox. We need an area that actually we don't mind if it gets messy. We need an area that people can just play and put their own content, and we don't want to be too structured about what they do with their own things. We don't want to have to stifle this creativity. And I scratched my head, and I didn't have an answer for it. Weirdly enough, there was an answer out there. And I only came across this probably within the last 6 to 8 months. It's always been possible to have a personal sandbox. It's just a question of getting the permissions right on maybe a generic folder that everybody has access to. So what that means is there will be a content that everybody can publish content to, but with the right permissions, you can make sure that they can only see their own content, okay? So it's a generic folder, but it's a personal one. What I mean is everybody can publish, but the only thing they can see is what they publish. And it automatically becomes a sandbox. And this has really always been capable, but it's just one of those little tricks that I didn't know for many, many years. Obviously, as an administrator, it's going to look like a mess, because you're still going to be able to see everything, right? But in terms of users and their own content and feeling safe about publishing their own things, it's an absolute sort of win-win, as it were. So that's just a quick tip, but I really love that one.
Yeah, I can kind of second that. I see clients using it very successfully, and it does encourage kind of creativity and experimentation and all that stuff. So it's a great little tip. So let's summarize what we talked about. How do we bring joy to Tableau Server, using Marie Kondo's words? So we talked about sites, projects, and nested projects. And the summary from that is nested projects are great from the user experience point of view, but watch out for permissions. And this is how we make a home for everything we own. The framework that Dave talked about is really something you should think about as you scale your Tableau Server. How do you come up with this template that can be applied across different types of content, different groups of users, and is also repeatable and can be easily summarized in the matrix, right, that we had on the slide. That's our plan. Automate tasks using APIs. Again, use community for that sort of stuff. There are many great ideas in the field, what people do with APIs, and the repository is also very useful to find the right information they want to take some action against. And finally, Sandbox is joy, right? So it's a great little way of encouraging people to find new insights and kind of experiment with Tableau more. All right, now we're going to open for Q&A.